Good morning, people. Let's call this conversation Preparing for the Forever Voyage, Episode 2. I haven't really defined for you what I mean by forever voyage, so allow me to engage in a certain amount of conjecture and lay something on you, because much of the conversation that we have been having, if it's not thought through entirely, can find to be pretty bleak, pretty grim, and pretty despairing. If you think it all the way through, especially thinking through what the basic central engendering cause of the crisis is, which is this hostile relationship between the individual and life, a tendency to relate to others in an exploitive manner rather than a constructive, loving manner. Once one understands that, once one understands that one has, at least in one's own personal sphere, the ability to take on and in fact personally defeat the central of most concerns, at least within one's sphere of influence. You can choose to be loving in spite of all that. And you think that all the way through, well, a very interesting future arises. One that is by no means certain, but potentially astonishing in its prospects, and we should discuss that. So if we were to apply a certain amount of, say, game theory to any of these mega threats, regardless of what they are, like we talked about in the last video, they have a central and often unacknowledged aspect, and that is that they are inevitable, even necessary consequences of collective exploitive behavior. And whether you want to think about issues like debt to GDP ratio, or exploitation of resource, or perhaps in some ways the most conceptual and easiest one to think about is climate change. That's the one where the physics is most clear. What happens is that if you get a group of individuals who believe that they have a right to plunder the collective good for personal gain, the end game is that, of course, the collective good gets plundered. And the individuals who, of course, plunder best become most rewarded, and they plunder only faster. That is the story of our civilization. However, collapse is an inevitable consequence of that once you run up against the real physical boundaries of the terrain which is available to you to exploit. Eventually you run out of stuff to steal, people to plunder, forests to cut down. Eventually that happens. Eventually, the sunlight that is sequestered in carbon bonds, all of that energy that has been historically stored in the ground, ends up dispersed in the atmosphere at its greatest level of entropic dispersion. There is no solution to that but to put energy back into it. And that can't happen in a culture that has an ever-expanding, voracious appetite for more, and believes somehow fundamentally that every individual has the right to that. Now, there's certain kinds of myopic individuals that believe, because they are so captivated within the civilizational perspective, that what we're describing here is behavior that is simply human nature, and it is absolutely and conspicuously not. Like, we are talking about values here that is unique, especially to Western colonial civilization. The most persistent cultures on planet Earth do not share this value. They put the individual in second place, behind the biome that supports the individual. The primary alliance is to the system itself, because it is recognized that the system is necessary for the individual to exist. We put the individual first and entitle the individual with the right to destroy the systemic whole for the individual. This is not a matter of conjecture. This is a matter of the historic record. But of course, individuals that plunder end up with a lot of power, and the cultures that do not plunder definitely get plundered. But again, the consequence is the same. The consequence is inevitable collapse, because plundering cultures finally run out of resource. And across the board, this is where we're at. Now, it's worth asking, where did this very perverse, hostile attitude towards reality come from? And that is worthy of a certain amount of inquiry. All right? From my own perspective, I would lay it at the feet, basically, of our Abrahamic religious history and tradition, wherein there was a group of individuals who came up with a unique conception of God, a patriarchal, jealous, very controlling, and in fact vindictive sky daddy that had a certain kind of interesting entitlement, which was this. Remember, this is elevated as divinity. You have a being that demands love from its children, in fact, at the threat of punishment, even violence and death. That is at the core center of Western civilization. There were competing ideologies, for sure, in Western civilization, but again, the idea that you can love, quote unquote, irrespective of the consequences to the object of your love, that there is a separation there, that love can be a non-consensual, inherently damaging thing. Well, that's a unique conception of love too, and it doesn't surprise me that a culture that would have such a perverse relationship with an idea of love, an idea of love that is commingled with violence, exploitation, punishment, condemnation, wrongness, brokenness, and the rest. Well, it wouldn't surprise me that individuals who felt that was some kind of ideal would also be able to justify all sorts of genocidal acts, would feel very little moral compulsion of stealing resource from other. It would be very easy, if you have that kind of absolutely self-referential view of love, to feel pretty smug while you literally, in a very hostile manner, take on the project of destroying life itself. In my opinion, that would be front and center. And, well, there are individuals out there that might not be bothered by the idea of a vindictive, highly punitive, highly demanding, highly exploitive sky daddy, but if that doesn't bother you, Well, I don't know that anything else I'm talking about would get through your crust. So perhaps start there. So there is a competing view of love that might be more constructive in directing the individual to have a complementary view and relationship with the creative life process, and that is to understand that love as it actually exists in the world is not an attitude but an action. In many ways, the problem in the conceptual idea of love as it expresses itself in Western civilization is the confusion and the commingling of the desire to love as opposed to the action of loving. And in fact, many people are simply satisfied by thinking they are loving individuals if they hold the desire to love. That's enough, rather than following through and actually manifesting and acting upon that love. They are separate things, and other cultures saw it that way. But of course, then love becomes an objective, measurable thing, and you have to behave in a manner that is objectively, measurably loving, or you can't think of yourself as a loving individual. But if you have the attitude where the actual results of your loving activity are absolutely distal from your attitude, well, then you can justify absolutely anything. Absolutely anything. The sick example that I like to use comes from my experience working in the juvenile justice program. Now, mind you, this was a very conservative, right-wing, extremely fundamentalist Christian society, and as such, full of child abuse, and especially pedophilia. One of the things I learned as a young man about pedophilia that forever changed my view about the nature of love is this. This should scare you. When you are working with individuals who are pedophiles, what you discover is this. Pedophiles honestly believe they love children. Pedophiles have a self-referential attitude where the feeling and the desire to love is all they need, and they pay no attention whatsoever, just like the bearded sky daddy, about what the actual consequences of that feeling or attitude are. There is no consideration paid whatsoever to the actual action of the loving. Can you draw some parallels there? And of course, you cannot reach an individual who considers love simply an attitude that is beyond the analysis of other, beyond criticism. And as such, you cannot reach pedophiles because they believe that they are loving people and they are simply misunderstood. This is an astonishingly toxic idea. But I think for many people in reflection, you can find that this same attitude that the pedophile holds is rife through our culture. You will find, with precious little inquiry, the mass of individuals in our culture who will say to you they love their children, or they love their dogs, their pets, their animals, or they love the natural world, or they love, who knows what, any sorts of things. They will say this when conspicuously their activities are at cross purposes precisely with that. We are living in a society where the parents are destroying the world for their children right now. They are consuming the future that their children need to have to survive. This is what's happening. And they're able to get away with it without any kind of contest of whether their love is genuine. Well, it's important, of course, to contest that, but it's impossible to contest that without demonstrating and articulating an alternative. And that is something that really needs to happen. And honestly, this contrary conception could be phrased very easily, and I could just whip it out for you just like this. Let's just assume that the conception from Buber that there are two essential postures in relating to other, one of which is I-it, which is exploitive destructive, and the other is I-thou, which is cooperative and co-creative. There is no middle ground. The I-it postures are never objectively loving. They are only exploitive. There is no love to be had in a relationship such as that. However, individuals who are operating under the false assumption that love can be purely a self-referential attitude, which is another form of exploitive behavior, can, for a while, especially if their feet are not held to the fire, can feel quite smug about the fact that they, like the pedophile, are loving individuals while creating very great harm. But if we move towards a conception that is life-affirming, we have to recognize that if we love genuinely, the consequences of the act of loving need to be a concern absolutely as important as the feeling that engendered it. And in that conception, love becomes very nearly a physical force. It becomes an action that is conscious, its results are measurable, its results are the result of skill, and it is successful in enhancing the welfare of the other, of its object, and in fact the systemic whole. If it doesn't rise to that level, it's not loving. Okay, so back to the forever voyage. I know that's very heavy stuff, but it's central and important. It's important because as we move through the inevitable collapse bottleneck, the inevitable consequences of the choices of our civilization, what happens? What happens? Well, exploiters run out of things to exploit. Exploiters do not have strategies for surviving in the world other than exploitation. But individuals that are loving, in fact, do, because they make their way through life by the creation of value as opposed to the extortion of value. The gateway that opens is in the collapse situation. There reemerges the opportunity for creative individuals to once again reemerge. How? Well, this gets into an interesting and often unobserved dynamic of systemic collapse that is really, really worth considering. If, say, you have a culture that is based on exploiting a resource, all right? Let's say it's fishing, but you could say that it's oil, you could say it's timber, you could say it's economics, you could say it's all sorts of things, all right? But let's just make it simple, because this is an example of a thing that is relevant to my lifestyle. Let's say that you have a culture that has become very prosperous because it overfishes a fisheries resource. All right? There comes a point where the plundering of the resource gets to be uneconomic, meaning that initially there's lots of fish in the sea, and it is profitable, especially for the greatest of exploiters, to go out there and drag big nets around and just tear the crap out of it and come back and profit handsomely. But eventually, the resource gets rarefied. Not extinct, but rarefied. There comes a point in which the needs of the culture that does the exploitation, because of course they are excessive, because of course they are based on exploitation, can no longer economically earn return on energy invested, and the fishing stops. That's really worth thinking about, because that's far before there are no fish. And I have observed this phenomenon firsthand, especially where I live here in British Columbia, and having lived on boats for a long time and always been a fisherman. 20 years ago, there was a large and aggressive fishery here, especially for bottom fish, reef fish, and the like. And fuel was cheap, and there was good money to be had in going out and pounding the crap out of the reef fish up here. And what happened, of course, is they caught them, or the lion's share of them. And it got to the point where if you were going out there and extorting the resource, fishing for profit, especially as fuel prices in a concomitant way became also rarefied, there became a set of circumstances in which it was no longer economically viable to go out there and destroy the reefs. And of course, finally, at that point, once no one wanted to do it anymore, they actually eliminated the fishery. Haha. Excellent demonstration of proactive regulation. So anyway, the commercial reef fish industry is basically gone up here. And what has happened, of course, is that the population of reef fish has rebounded, but not to the level of it being economically inviable for commercial exploitation. However, for an individual like myself, who lives within that habitat and whose interest in fishing is only subsistence, even though the fishery is not bountiful enough to have commercial viability, it's absolutely bountiful enough to support the very few individuals who can constructively live within that habitat. And it's actually really good fishing, where 20 years ago it was terrible. This kind of dynamic will emerge throughout all sectors, where individuals who have the skill and ability to live below the threshold of the needs of the exploitive class will find that, if they choose to do so, there's going to be significant prosperity. In fact, an increase in prosperity in a lot of areas, because they will no longer need to compete in the resource with the extortive class, because the extortive class becomes too rarefied for the needs of that class. But if your needs are, well, more that of a loving individual who wants to live harmoniously within real constraints of what the resource can bear, if you choose to do that, you might find it's remarkably abundant. Not as abundant as it might have been in history, but abundant enough. So remarkable, really, here, I'm suggesting, in this prospect for the forever voyage. The forever voyage is this, in fact. It is the deliberate attempt to move towards, in whatever way you find fitting or able, and of course, I'm the mariner, towards a world there where once again love dominates. And in fact, if an individual reflects about a conception of love as a dynamic and an action, such as I suggest, If you reflect on life as a choice between I, it, and I, thou postures, you look at it from the point of view of a world that has been hitherto dominated by the exploiters, but the exploiters have rarefied the environment. You discover quite quickly that the only viable possible strategy is to go gung-ho on readopting a loving posture towards life, because the alternative is to try to compete within the game of exploiting, and that has an end game that is very near. That cannot be done. It will be tried, but it cannot be done. And it's not really that one will need to fight the exploiters, really, although perhaps defend yourself against them intermittently, because in fact the exploiters will destroy themselves. This is the collapse bottleneck that I've talked about. The major concern here is the next 5, 10, or 15 years as civilization starts to consume itself. Because the fallout of exploitive people with a hostile relationship towards life in a knockdown, drag-out attempt, some kind of last stand, trying to breathe some life into a project doomed to fail, you want to stay clear of that fight. So the strategy for the loving individual is, as much as possible, step away and disengage and keep your powder dry and learn your skills and flex that muscle of being a loving co-participant in life as much as possible, because that skill set is your survival resource, and it is something that cannot be stolen from you. And when the dust finally settles, if there is anything left of humanity, and that's an if, but I expect there will be, the only people with any power to exist in the world that remains will be those loving individuals. The meek will, in fact, inherit the earth. The earth may be very screwed up, but the meek will have the ability, perhaps, to provide some remedy there. Especially as these meek, because they have the only winnable strategy, the only strategy that can persist through time, will largely inherit the legacy and the tools that were created by exploitive civilization. And those tools might be astonishingly potent. There is a chance, in fact, that if you happen to be one of those individuals that survive the next 10 or 15 years, and humanity is forced to evolve into a posture of living in harmony with reality or going extinct, personally, globally, socially, at all levels, if that's the only choice that remains, you will have individuals in possession of that attitude. I, thou remains the only game in town, yet you may be in possession of the tools, like, for example, radical lifespan enhancing technology, radical medical technology, all sorts of crazy opportunities. There may be a possibility to become fundamentally immortal. There may be a possibility to become fundamentally, functionally divine. We don't know how far that will take us if anything survives the collapse bottleneck, and in fact, loving people end up being the only ones who can weather the transition. Now, this is by no means a guarantee, but it's not a wingnut idea. And certainly it is a interesting enough prospect that I believe it's worth an individual who at this point might have been feeling a great deal of despair, well, this perspective might give you a certain amount of inspiration to get your ship together and prepare for this voyage, because there's an opportunity here for something really profound, a fundamental evolutionary shift towards a different kind of relating as human beings to the universe. And I would encourage you, it's worth a shot to see if you could pull that off. What's the other option? Simply perish? So once again, I'm into this idea about 30 minutes now. I appreciate if you stuck with me here. I know this is a pile of stuff to chew on. And we're going to try it in one more video to really tighten this up and make it more concise. What I'm suggesting, really, in a nutshell, is this. Civilization is going to collapse because of the inherent assumptions and dynamics within civilization, mostly that civilization is predicated on exploitation. It justifies exploitation primarily because civilization, at least our civilization, is based on a hostile, very sick view of love that stems from a certain kind of religious tradition. Okay? But it's not human nature. It is a unrecognized, unsupported assumption that is inherent within our civilization, which has given it a great deal of potency, but at the expense of the systemic whole. And in fact, what is the inevitable consequence of that? Well, we've run out of people to screw over. Here we are. And like any other kind of depleted environment, there comes a point where it's no longer economic to try to exploit the resource as an exploiter. The only people that can function in rarefied environments are those that can actually coexist within them, and that their needs are modest enough, and that their ability to exist and harmonize with their biome is constructive and complementary rather than destructive. That is the only game left. This is going to sort out over the next 10 or 15 years, and I'm sure that the exploiters are going to dial up their exploiting through every means at their disposal to try to screw the last juice out of that orange. But eventually it won't work, can't work. It's a battle against entropy, and entropy is going to win that game. There you go. This suggests a strategy. Life, if it is anything, is an anti-entropic process. If you love life, your attitude needs to be anti-entropic. There is no way that you can accelerate entropy by wantonly destroying resource, life, and value, and thinking that you're possibly going to have any persistence to your existence. That's it. It's practically physics. So I will leave you with that. I know that's a ton of stuff. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts and comments. Cheers, people. I'm going to have to go to work.